That would be your superpower. The superpower of rational thought and cool-headedness.
The critiques of universalism always just say the universal is not itself actually a universal.
There is a for-all. Hey, everybody. What's going on? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I am Troy Polidori.
And this week we are going to be doing something a little bit different. We're starting up a book club of sorts. A book club with just me and Troy. So it's like a book duo. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through a text and kind of teasing out some of the themes and talking about some of the concepts, and then, of course, just doing what we regularly do with everything, but it's going to be based around a particular text over a course of a few weeks, I would imagine. The text is called OaD Universalism, Volume 1, and then there's a OaD Universalism Volume 2 by Sergei Prozorov, and the first volume is about ontology and politics and whether or not there is such a thing as a universal, groundable ontology that grounds world politics, and then the second one is about political subjectivity. So if that just sounds like mumbo-jumbo to you, it'll make a little more sense in a minute, but first we have something that we got to get out. Something we got to get off of our chest. It's the shitty minute. And this is the segment where one of us gets to rant and rave about what it is that's pissing us off this week or over the past couple of days or something like that. Last week was my turn. That means this week, Troy is up to bat. What's the problem, man?
Austin, have you seen the latest Avengers movie?
Yeah.
Okay, so I saw the latest Avengers movie. It's Infinity War. And there's a lot of hubbub about Thanos being a real badass villain, a really great character, and that the movie somehow centers around his character specifically. And I don't see it. Thanos is on some bullshit, I feel like. When you have a really great villain, it's because the villain's reasoning and logic is compelling, but that his or her conclusion seems repugnant. That's usually how great villains are developed, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, think of even just in the comic book universe, think of how Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight, and the Joker had compelling reasoning. Now his conclusions were repugnant because morally you feel like I just can't go there for whatever reason. And you have to think to yourself, why is it that I can't go there? But the reasoning is compelling. Mm-hmm. I don't find Thanos' reasoning. I don't think there even is reasoning. So I mean, I just saw this once, and I was kind of half paying attention to most of it because it's a comic book movie. There's 60 million characters that I can't follow, but maybe you can help me out with this. The basic idea was spoilers, obviously. The basic idea was Thanos' home planet, half the people were killed, or half the people weren't killed, and if they were, they would have somehow survived later on. It was something like that, right?
Something along those lines.
Yeah, so he learns the lesson through a very small sample size, so hasty generalization much, that he needs to kill half of the living things on any planet, and eventually he decides in the universe in order to save it. And so it's mm-hmm. in line with those classic utilitarian scenarios, right? Will you engage in some short-term, what seems like an evil, for the greater good in the long term, which cancels out the short-term evil and actually shows you to be a much more rational and patient and reasonable individual because you saw the long-term good and didn't let your emotions sway you towards only the short-term good.
Right.
And those are classical utilitarian scenarios that you read all the time, right? But I don't get the logic in Thanos' argument. It's you remember in that South Park episode, the Underpants Gnomes?
Yeah.
So the Underpants Gnomes, they collect underpants from people when they're sleeping. And then you go into the gnomes lair, and it says on the big board there, step 1, collect underpants. Step 2, ? Step 3, profit. I feel like Thanos is on some underpants gnomes logic shit right here. He's kill half of the living things in the universe. Step 1. Step 2, ? Step 3, profit.
Counterpoint. maybe step 2 is going to come back and bite him in the ass, and ultimately he's going to realize that it's not really satisfying, and that's why you have to have a part 2, because you know that this is part 1 of part 2, right?
Yeah, but I mean, he there's plenty of time given to Thanos to reason out why he thinks this needs to happen. And there's even a compelling scene where he has to sacrifice his own daughter for this, and he's actually sad about it, like legitimately sad about it, but he feels like his mission is so important, he's willing to even make himself suffer to see it through. So like they're really pushing the Thanos is being reasonable even if he's evil. He's not like some crazed maniac villain, right?
Well, it's like some sort of fate or destiny that he feels that he has to fulfill, right?
Yeah, but why? I don't get the reasoning.
What if it's this? What if it goes down to that platonic notion of kind of the fulfillment of the lack that you feel in the universe, right? Like the restoring balance to the cosmos. And he just groans with the universe that is out of order in his, albeit misperceived notion based on, as you said, a hasty generalization. But nevertheless, that's how he feels. He feels the groans of the cosmos. And so he needs to like seek that balance and seek the sort of alleviation of the lack of everything. And that's what it is. Because you see it at the end, right? In the final scene when he's sitting down, there's almost a momentary satisfaction where he seems relieved or pleased. But then there's, again, that moment of dissatisfaction that comes in, which then also fits with Plato's notion that obviously dissatisfaction is always going to continue to emerge in the material world because it's in flux and things like that. So even though you may feel the perceived metaphysical notion of imbalance of the cosmos, you're never going to be able to fully alleviate that desire or that lack in the material world, even though you may try. Am I giving him too much credit?
Yeah, I think that's really abstract shit right there. I think the really important thing is that Thanos needed to follow like the pattern of replication of his studies. Like he took one study, like, oh, coffee is good for you, and then just sort of like drank all the coffee in the universe. And it's like, bro, replicate your studies. Maybe try it on a few planets, see if it works overall, and then kill half of all living things in the universe. You're just kind of assuming this is gonna work, and it's like I don't even know what it's working for. Like, what's supposed to be the goal of this? Everybody's like happy or something. I don't get it. Like, and
better allocation of resources,
dude. You have the fucking Infinity Gauntlet. Can't you just like make all the resources? Isn't scarcity
that's
gone?
what I didn't understand. Yeah, right. That's why didn't he do the opposite? Why not create abundance rather than respond to this perceived scarcity where you have like the reality ring? Isn't that one of them? Or the reality stone? Like if you can snap your finger and literally change reality and like make people evaporate into nothing, can't you also like make food come into being? And can't you also like make weapons disappear? And then couldn't you also make like anger disappear? Like, come on, dude, be more creative.
Yeah, I mean, like, why are we thinking in such a strict little box here? It's like when you bring up like, the problem of evil, right, in philosophy of religion, and you start naming off all the different natural evils in the world, and people will say things like, yeah, well, who knows? Maybe that natural evil had to happen, or else some other good couldn't have happened. And it's like, bro, like I'm pretty sure God could figure it out so that there could only be the good stuff and not be any of the evil stuff necessary to get there. So if Thanos is the fucking god and has, I mean, I don't know what these infinity, I forget all the different stones, right? But there's like a whole lot of power there. Probably enough to where you don't have to do this very haphazard Rube Goldberg machine development of the ideal universe. Like you could probably sit down with the Avengers and like hash some shit out, like democratically, or I guess it's more like oligarchically. But you could hash some shit out and then build a better universe rather than this whole thing. I just don't get it.
I feel you, brother.
Thanos is dumb.
I feel you. Thanos is dumb. He's misguided, Troy.
I don't know about misguided so much as maybe it is misguided. Like, why didn't any of the Avengers just say, dude, like, your logic is faulty?
God, don't you wish that would be your superpower? The superpower of rational thought and cool-headedness.
That's the thing,
under
though, right?
Situations of extreme duress.
That's the thing. If you have like a maniac villain who doesn't listen to reason, then you can't do that, right? Because they're just going to do whatever they want. They're driven by their id or whatever. But that's not a compelling villain because they're really one-dimensional. A compelling villain is someone who actually does listen to reason and just out-reasons you, and leads you towards conclusions you don't want. You find repugnant. And so he does that, but then no one challenges him on that. They're always like, we must just stop this villain as if he's a maniac.
Yeah, it's because we need superheroes to the left, right? From your very first shitty minute
fucking call
ever
back
on this podcast,
there.
right? Right? Because then they would actually try to be productive in their transformation of things rather than either reproductive or reactive. But these superheroes, they're just reactive.
Yeah, dialectical critique man would have been an ideal Avenger to have at this point in time.
That would be so awesome. Yeah.
He could just go to every superhero and just like point out the fault in their material logic. They would have been great. All right, so now we're going to start talking about the book we're doing for our book club, our Parliamentary Owls at Dawn exclusive proprietary book club. We'll shorten that name eventually, I think. And what we're going to do today is, and this is all experimental, so we're going to see how this goes and maybe adjust things in the future. There's no like hard and fast rules here. But we thought that today we'd talk about the introduction to the book and also the context of international relations and world politics that Prozorov is writing in before we jump into the real meat of the arguments in the book. So we'll start off there. And if Austin, do you think, given that you did recommend this book, and I'm guessing you had particular reasons for recommending it and particular reasons for wanting to read it yourself, can you give a little bit of the background on what the book's about, what Prozorov's goal is, and the context, academic context of it?
Sure. So Sergei Prozorov is a Russian scholar who teaches and researches in Finland at Helsinki University in international relations. And I think maybe the easiest way to look at this is that there is a tension in the field of international relations with trying to identify what exactly do these terms mean. So like, what is international? What do we mean when we're talking about international relations? And then similarly, I guess there was a shift in the 90s more towards thinking about this idea of world politics. And sometimes people talk about cosmopolitanism. And is that different? So in the field of international relations, you had this emergent body of work that would shift from thinking about international relations to world politics. And the reasoning for that was that international relations seemed to be maybe essentially conflictual. It was about individual nation states and how it was that they sort of kind of, how they react, if you will, across lines horizontally throughout the world, whereas world politics seemed to be at least tending towards or aiming towards a more universal approach, a more universal grounding on how it was that you would do politics, how you would order the world under a single rubric. And it kind of fell into two different traps, either what you might call universalization or particularization. And the universalization was basically kind of figures out a hegemonic particular idea and then sort of inflates it, usually at the behest of a single power, a single nation state, or a single sovereign idea. So, you know, the idea of the Washington Consensus, for example, with the United States on how to handle emerging nations and what would be the strategy for foreign aid and for foreign relations is driven by the logic of the United States and some of their kind of, let's say, biased or their own vested interests, rather than just simply looking out for the well-being of the particular nation. And so what you get then is you get a sort of universalization of a particular idea that gets inflated to a universal, right? And this is a problem that Prozorov talks about is a problem with most universalisms that get espoused, you know, that they derive from a singular particular vision or idea or logic, and they become inflated and then projected onto the totality, which then stifles difference in other locales that aren't conditioned by that initial particularization, right? So that's one ditch that he sees as being a problem. The other ditch is just radical particularization, which he thinks can fall into what he calls nihilism, or maybe even potentially just a relativism, like a cultural relativism. And that's where you basically just have these competing regional particular sentiments or ideas of how to do politics. And what he ultimately wants to do is he wants to navigate between those two extremes. He wants to try to find, or maybe not even between, but maybe just sort of beyond,
Or beneath.
right? Because it's not like, yeah, or beneath, yeah, which is better, which is why he actually talks about the void. And so he wants to navigate on a different register that doesn't fall into either the trap of universalization or the trap of radical nihilism or particularization. So what he wants to do then is he wants to then try to shift towards whether or not it's possible to ground a world politics where you talk about whatever the word world means, whatever the world politics means, and can you ground that in some sort of ontology? And ontology is generally understood as the sort of inquiry into, from Aristotle, the inquiry into the nature of being qua being, which basically just means the science of what is. Right? So whenever you say anything is something, you're talking about ontology, the ontos, which is the being of things. So if you're saying, I am a such and such, or that is a such and such, or reality is a particular way, whenever you're making those statements, those is statements are appealing to the being of the being that you're talking about, the being of the entity that you're referring to. So then he wants to look at world politics and he wants to say, well, what is this world of which we speak when we're talking about world politics? And then what is politics? So what do these things refer to when we're speaking about them? And he wants to ground them in an ontology. And the reason he wants to do that is because if you can ultimately kind of say what the world is, and then simultaneously, if you can ultimately say what politics is, then you can have a universal idea of politics that doesn't seem to fall into, in his mind, and his hope is that it won't fall into either the universalization of the particular or just the radical proliferation of the particulars.
Yeah, I think that's a really good encapsulation of the context of where Prozorov is writing. And I just want to add something about ontology. A good way to sort of conceptualize what ontology is getting at is what do all things that exist have in common? So once you strip away all the things that are particular about specific things, so one thing might be red, one thing might be round, one thing might be a human, one thing might be a plant or an inanimate object or whatever. What's the one thing all those things share? Well, it's existence. So what does that mean, existence? Ontology tries at its very barest bones to get to what that is. The reason Prozorov wants to get there is because he thinks that that's sort of the area where everything can have something in common. If there's anywhere things are going to have something in common, something universal will be at the level of being. So ontology is the site for wherever this commonality is, if it exists at all. And of course, he's going to go through some dialectical process to try and figure that out. But that's just the sort of context and the side of where we're talking here.
Mm-hmm.
So could we talk a little bit about universalism and particularism and those two kind of big 25-cent words and what they mean?
Yeah. Start things off. What are you thinking?
So I guess we start with universalism. So as using the context here, universalism, would it be correct to say, just means any conception of, I guess we're talking here mainly in like political theory, any conception of what the good society or ideal society, or in this case, world would be, that applies to everybody. Is that the simplest way to term it?
Yeah, I think so. It applies to everybody. It's absolute, I think, as well, right? It's something that is not contingent.
It never changes.
Yeah, it never changes. Exactly. So it's necessary. So, the Christian narrative that there is one God for all, it's the God as represented through the Bible, as understood through the traditions of the church, and that there is one path to salvation, faith in Jesus, no matter where you are, no matter who you are. That would be a sort of universal claim. Obviously, that's not politics, at least not in the explicit sense. It can maybe have political implications, or maybe it is a type of anti-politics, but that's a universalist kind of claim. So, yeah, I think that's basically it.
Yeah, you take that into the realm of politics, and you have things like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages using natural law to try and figure out what the sort of ideal society and ideal form of life is in that society.
In the Middle Ages, I think the Catholic Church is still trying to do that a little bit, aren't they?
Well, I mean, more successful at trying to do that, I guess would be the term.
Yeah. Matter of fact, my one of my old master's degree supervisors just tweeted out in response to Ireland's repealing the eighth angrily, basically saying that the time will come, maybe. Well, he hints that maybe the time will come when like democratic means and like peaceful means won't be the only way to reinstitute natural law, and that if we keep fighting against natural law, like somehow repercussions are going to emerge. So it was like a subtle, like almost threat of Thomist violence. It was really weird. I was like, whoa, dude, getting crazy on us over Twitter here.
Yeah, I mean, that I think shows, if anything, the absurdity of the idea of natural law in the first place. Just because people like Milbank, right, taking stuff from like the Middle Ages and going.
I didn't say a name. I didn't say a name. This was him. This was just a presumption. I'm not saying. I didn't say who it was.
You gave a definite
John
description.
Milbank.
You denoted, so I'm going to say that you said it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think pretty much everybody who's listening to this would agree that, in some sense, the idea that there would be an absolute universal, like we're talking about, is pretty hard to accept nowadays. It's not an idea you can just prop up and be like, yeah, it sounds reasonable. You would have all of the burden of proof on you to claim such a thing. And Prozorov admits that, and he says universals or universalisms are in disrepute today. They're generally seen with a giant amount of skepticism, if not just outright dismissal by the very fact that they are a universalism.
Right. But then there does seem, remember we talked about this last week with Jared, is there does seem to be this sort of, this re-territorialized desire for particular universals in people being attracted to these particular narratives about, free speech and liberal progress and liberal Western democracies. And those, when they get defended the way that they do, one of the things that they run into is they run into this problem of universalization. And that's why there's so much backlash. You have someone like a Jordan Peterson who is critical of postmodernism because postmodernity is precisely critical of universalisms, right? The criticism of meta-narrative or the skepticism towards meta-narrative and these universal, grand, overarching stories is largely rooted in this type of criticism. But there seems to be, in some ways, there's always this push and this pull, right? Between, maybe not always, but there's definitely a push and a pull, we'll say, between the sort of deconstruction of these grand narratives or of these large singular beacons of meaning, and then, of course, the idea to re-erect new ones or to re-erect or reestablish ones that already exist. And so this is actually a really interesting practical thing because we're saying this now, like when people are saying, no, we got to protect free speech, we got to protect free speech. In what way is that a universal claim, but that's derived from a very particular historical orientation, derived from 18th century revolutions and things like that really focused on what we might call liberal values, Western liberal values. And so in the field of international relations, there's been a lot of skepticism to them because they've been influenced, if you will, by postmodernism or the postmodern critiques of universalism. So it is interesting to think from that side. Yeah,
I think the liberal democratic values thing you're bringing up is a good example of that, right? Because when people defend free speech as a universal, usually what the argument is, it seems to me at least implicitly, is we need to defend free speech at all costs because it's the only mechanism by which we can achieve something resembling the ideal society. Maybe not perfectly, but as best as we can. And there's a sort of logic there, which is that if we have free speech, then there'll be a marketplace of these ideas where people won't be forced out of, and then the best ideas will end up winning by the same logic that you'll have a sort of what do you call it, when the market's in equilibrium and everyone gets the best possible outcome. Mm-hmm. That same process is supposed to occur with free speech and with ideas, right? And there's a lot of just incorrect and wrong thinking about that, right? As if we just naturally tend towards ideas that are correct and rational and best for us in an open marketplace of ideas, if such a marketplace could even exist. And so, again, the postmodern critiques will come in and say that universal isn't really what it says it is. I think this is kind of the key that Prozorov was getting at that I found really helpful in understanding the process of the 20th century critique of universalisms, is that the critiques of universalisms always just say the universal is not itself actually a universal. It's a particular masquerading as a universal. And what we mean by that is that by a particular, we mean all the things that a universal is not, right? Universals are absolutes. Particulars can change. They're contingent. Universals are necessary. Particulars are not. They're rooted in a certain time, in a certain place, in certain desires, in certain hypothetical scenarios, whereas the universals are categorically true. And so you have this sort of binary here, right? And the critique of universalisms always just say it's not actually universalism. It's rooted in contingent and non-necessary and hypothetical and all these different things, even though it's pretending not to be.
Right.
And that seems to me really important, because it's not saying universalisms are necessarily, in some sense, not to be preferred or bad or should be rejected, but just that when they show themselves, they're never actually what they claim to be.
Right, and that's precisely the point, is that he likes the criticism that these universalisms... What's going on over there? Breaking
my
shit?
Stupid cup keeps getting connected to my... God damn it.
But so that's the criticism that he's actually willing to concede, that he wants to say that sort of indictment of universalisms is accurate. You know, the way that we have understood universalisms is problematic because it is subject to these particularist criticisms. But simultaneously, he doesn't want to just fall into then advocating these particularisms, because he calls it a nihilism. Now, when I first read it, I didn't like that.
I did.
Because you like that, yeah. But see, I just have a problem with the word nihilism because it gets thrown around so much, right? And I know that there are all these different subsets of nihilism, right? Like existential nihilism and cosmic nihilism and blah, blah, blah. And I think there are sometimes 4 categories of nihilism that are generally bandied about, but fucking everyone uses it. Like, you're just a nihilist, or, Big Lebowski. We believe in nothing, Lebowski. We are nihilists. Like, what the fuck? Like, what do you mean? That's the worst. I don't know what accent that was.
Yeah, it usually just means you're just moody or something.
Yeah, right? Yeah. You're moody and you wear black and you listen to fucking Trent Reznor or some shit like that. You're a nihilist. You don't believe in anything. You're a grump face. But like, why did you like it when he said that the sort of radical particularism leads to nihilism, or that is nihilism?
Well, the way I like to conceive it is that nihilism just means nothing. So whatever category you're a nihilist about, you're saying that category does not exist. It's an empty set. There is no thing that is that thing, right? So like moral nihilists don't believe that there are moral facts, objective moral facts at all. Mereological nihilists don't believe that there are wholes. There are only particulars that don't form any composite wholes, and so on and so forth, right? So the way I took it here was just that it's a universalist nihilism. A nihilist in this context just argues that there is no such thing as a universal. All universals are actually particulars.
Then why wouldn't you go and say that the universalism that is the sort of inflated particularism, why can't we say that that's also a nihilism, because it's the suppression of difference, so it ignores difference. It's a nihilist towards difference, which is what I would want to say. Because that's more of like a Nietzschean criticism. That would be very similar to Nietzsche's criticism of affirmation of difference, which I think that's nihilist.
Sure. I mean, yeah, they're both nihilists, just in different ways. Right? Because like universalism is
now Prozorov doesn't say that, but if we're going to say that, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, if we're typically going to term it, you could be a universalist and be a nihilist about difference. You could also be a particularist and be a nihilist about universalisms. So
I'm okay with that.
I think he's referring to the latter, though. He's saying that particularism can fall into a nihilism in denying that there are no such thing as universalisms. And then he thinks it's a problem. It's a bad thing in the end, because those particulars tend to have no way to promote themselves other than through brute force, which is to say, this is the particular that exists at this time and place, and if you're in this time and place, then you should adopt it, and then have no reasoning to back it up, because reasoning sounds like you're forming a universal when you do that. And so really you only have brute force or you have nothing. And he thinks that either leads to violence or a dead end. And neither of those are sort of obviously good opportunities for you. And I kind of agree with that. We were just talking about Jordan Peterson and some of the resurgence of these more conservative moral and political ethos that's kind of growing up, has a little bit of the groundswell in America right now. And as much as I think you're right to say it has more in common with the old universals than with like the postmodern critiques. It does have a really strong resemblance with the kind of particularist language that we're talking about here that's very much situated in the 20th and 21st century, in that it's not usually trying to build some grand narrative behind it. Now, I know Peterson has like his Jungian archetypes and shit like that, right? But I don't think that's really what's attracting people towards it. What's attracting them is some kind of like identity. It gives them a certain identity they can grab hold of and find meaning in, and they're not getting that from anywhere else because there's a void of that stuff out there, or the ones that exist exclude them for whatever reason, and so they're kind of grabbing onto that. We talked about this actually a lot when we went to our evangelical college, right? There were certain professors there, who shall not be named, who actually really enjoyed the postmodern critiques of universalisms and thought that that gave an opportunity for kind of a resurgent form of Christianity, like an ancient future type of Christianity, as one term used it, to say, you know what, we can posit our particular identity and our particular language and theology and not have any reasoning to back it up, and that's totally fine, because you can't do that anymore, or you're not allowed to do that anymore, or you're termed ideologically violent or whatever. So all that to say, I think Prozorov's right in this diagnostic claim that he makes, that the reason we needed to critique the universalisms is because they were dominating and they were violent and they excluded difference, and those things are all correct. But if the reason we were doing that is because we didn't want to be violent and we didn't want to be dominating and we wanted to allow difference, the world that's only particulars fighting against one another doesn't exactly resolve that problem by itself, at least.
Right. So if I can just read a couple sections that sort of from the text, he says that this book attempts to transform the aporia, that is the dead end, into which the critique of universalism has led itself by the exposure of its particularism, into a euporia, which is literally a happy path, which resolves the problems of universalism within the frame of universalism itself. And then he continues on a minute and he says, what is criticized here is not universalism, but particularism that pretends to accede to universality in the manner that is always illegitimate, fake, and ultimately futile. And then again, we ought to pose the question of the possibility of a genuine universalism that does not relapse into a hegemonic universalization of some particular content. And so that's the goal, is he wants to then actually ground the possibility for a universalism that doesn't fall into the trap of either the universalization of the particular or just the simple proliferation of relative particulars.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the real point there, and maybe you can correct me if maybe I'm going off the track here, but if we define universalism or a universalism as an absolute that applies to all, that usually entails domination, exclusion of difference, and all that stuff, but it doesn't necessarily entail it. It just contingently has every time. I guess would be the point.
Right, and there's a really simple kind of way of thinking about this, like almost a spatial metaphor of a difference between a top-down and a bottom-up, right? And I think what he's really going to ultimately be criticizing are what we might call top-down universalisms. Universalisms that start off, let's say, at the ground. You have a particular, let's say, the American idea of international relations or foreign relations through the Washington Consensus. That's the particular. Then what you do is you inflate it to the status of universal. That then becomes the benchmark for how to do world politics, which means that any individual different form that pops up around any different region becomes subsumed underneath that top-down pressure. Whereas what he wants to build, and he wants to really build bottom-up, because he wants to even go, let's say, beneath the surface, what he calls into the void, and he wants to then actually build from the ground up. I actually spent some time. Remember, I spent some time with Prozorov in Italy, right?
Yeah, that conference.
So I spent some time with Prozorov in Italy, and at a week-long seminar in fucking paradise in Grotto, Italy, which was one of the most amazing weeks of my life. But basically, the title of his talk then was "From the World to the Void and Back." So rather than starting from the particular to the sky of universalisms and then reimposing that universalism onto difference, his approach is to start from the world, because you're already thrown right into the midst of a world. We can't escape our material existence. We're in it. But to dig down, let's say, to keep a spatial metaphor going, down beneath the surface to the ground of being, which he then ultimately says is actually a void, the nothing, das Nicht. This is where there's a nihilism there, right? But that's where the ground of reality is, the ground of being is. It's the void of nothing. And you go in there, but then you can't stay there forever because you have to exist in the world. But you can learn some things by archaeologically digging beneath the surface into the void. And then you can come back and you can bring those principles universally back to the world, because they are the ground on which the world kind of rests, right? And for him, he thinks that there are these three axioms that you'll ultimately be able to find there, and it's equality, freedom, and community. And he is going to try to build his idea that there are these three universal axioms that participate in or that derive from the void, and that is the basis for what he calls a void universalism. And so the question is how does he get there? And I don't know if we want to kind of jump into that yet, or if you still want to keep pressing on other issues, but maybe.
Oh, you got me hyped, man. But I haven't read the part one yet,
okay.
So we should save that for. This is our advertisement for the listeners out there to go and get the book and start reading it. So we don't want to give away. We don't have the sex scene just yet.
That's right.
Let's just show a little shoulder. All right.
That's right. This is the scene, when you're watching the movie and the sex scene is coming. You can predict it, like the jazz music is playing or the synth music is playing, and it's like Top Gun, where they have that fight where she's chasing him in the car and he's all pissed off, and then all of a sudden you can hear "Take My Breath Away" starting to play in the background.
Yeah, I got it now.
That's where we're at right now.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to ask you, and this is purely selfish on my part. So with this whole talk about the fact that there are no universals is itself kind of the only universal. That's sort of what we're getting at with the idea of void here. Do you see the connection here between this and Meyasu? Why I got kind of excited about that?
No. I mean, I didn't think about Meyasu, but I mean, I can see it. But go ahead, talk about this a little more.
See, I mean, I don't know how this is going to play out throughout the rest of the book because I have not read it. But Meyasu's basic point was that we can go. Seeing Kant kind of as the critical component, criticizing, the old school metaphysical rationalism, and showing that all metaphysical rationalism doesn't actually achieve what it says it's going to achieve, right? And so his own metaphysics is one of critique. Meyasu wants to go through that critique rather than just accept it, and so say that the critique itself does show a certain thing we can rationally demonstrate to be absolute, and that's contingency itself. And so in the same way, isn't so far Prozorov kind of saying that we can take the critique of the particularist critique, the postmodern critique of universals, and instead of
like the critique of correlation, or the critique of universals,
of rationalism,
so either one,
right? And then go through it rather than just tarry with it, and find a universal in that critique itself. In the same way, Meyasu wanted to find an absolute in contingency itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think in orientation, there's a similar project, right? It's like the radicalization of the problem, which is a very Hegelian idea.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Right?
Right?
Or
it's a triad.
Yeah, it's a very Hegelian impetus. But I think their projects are very different.
Oh yeah, Meyasu is making more of an epistemological point and a metaphysical point about the absolute, whereas Prozorov's talking about political theory and international relations. So yeah, but yeah, the formal aspect of it is pretty similar.
Yeah. Now, you have said recently that you took a seminar on Heidegger and you fucking hated it. Now, Prozorov says, not that you hated the seminar, but you hate Heidegger now.
No,
you're tired of Heidegger.
I'm tired of Heidegger. I wouldn't say I hate Heidegger.
Okay, now the two figures that drive this project are Alain Badiou, which is somebody who I know you're really interested in and that you want to kind of explore further, and your boy Martin Heidegger. So when we read this, I was reading it and I was laughing because he literally is like, these are the two kind of figures. And even though They might disagree on pretty much everything. There's one thing that they do agree on, and it's this idea of the void, the nothing, as being a sort of ground of reality, right? So are you reticent at all that we're going to be doing some Heideggerian shit, or are you kind of okay with this?
No, you know me too well, man. Yeah, I mean, certainly reading this introduction, I was wondering, how in the hell can you really combine Heidegger and Badiou in a way without really bastardizing at least one, if not both? So I'm interested to see how he does it. That said, I do think there's a lot you can gain from Heidegger. I don't think that a Heideggerian philosophy is going to get you very far by itself. But if you use it for as a means to a particular end, I think it's certainly possible. And my guess is Prozorov is going to try to do something like that, seeing as his project seems much more aligned with something Badiou would want to do, at least on the surface, and not so much with what Heidegger would want to do, since the postmodern critiques and the particularisms that we're talking about stem in many ways from Heidegger, talking about the different kinds of worlds you can be in. And so I do think, and you can maybe, if you've read further, tell me if this is where he's going, but he's going to kind of do a little bit more of a radicalization of Heidegger, like the kind of radicalization we're talking about. Go through.
Exactly. He's going through all these figures. Except I don't think he goes through Badiou. I think he is way more faithful to a Badiou's project than he is to Heidegger. But I'm surprised he sets it up as being like Heideggerian vis-a-vis Badiou rather than like Foucault, which is how I kind of see his project. And he does talk about Agamben a bit, who he categorizes as a post-Heideggerian, which I'm okay with, because it is this sort of like post-phenomenological shift. But to me, like, Foucault would be one of the sort of figureheads, and he actually doesn't mention him at all in either the preface or the introduction, which is interesting to me.
Do you think the point is, well, Foucault's more on the epistemology side, whereas Heidegger's more on the ontology side, and since he's focusing on ontology, he wants to take the side of the coin that has more to do with that?
Maybe. Yeah. Maybe that's it. Yeah, that could be it. Yeah, because if you're talking about like Foucault's ontology, then you're doing a lot of legwork, because obviously Foucault doesn't explicitly build an ontology himself, right? Whereas someone like Agamben, who's a post-Heideggerian thinker, is building an ontology in a lot of ways, or at least working within the frame of ontology. So, yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see, and we'll come back to this when we do our next few episodes on it, and see if some of these things we're talking about in the introduction are going to be fulfilled, or were fulfilled in ways different than we expected. And that'll be a sort of fun way to recapitulate, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, probably just, are we kind of wrapping up this intro context building session?
Yeah, I think we've introduced and contextualized and sold this fairly well.
Cool.
I would read this book now.
I will read this book now. Yeah, so real quick, then just kind of summing up what he says his two projects are, or his two steps in this project are. One, he says it's to reconsider the concept of the world as such, and two, to redefine politics on the basis of this revised concept of the world as such. And so that's the question. And sometimes in philosophical circles, there's this debate in whether or not there is a relation, a necessary relation, or what is the relation, or what are the consequences of the relation between ontology and a theory of being and politics. And are they necessarily related? Are they separate? How do they inform one another? Do they matter if you're talking about politics? Is your politics deficient if you don't have an ontology? That sort of thing. And what he wants to do is ultimately ground it and say, in a sense, yeah, your politics is deficient if you don't have a universalist ontology to ground it, because you're going to fall into one of those other traps that we talked about, either the universalisms or the particularisms. And so, in order to properly be able to talk about world politics, you have to have a universal ontology, and that's what his project is going to do. He's going to build that universal ontology.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I really, really like how Prozorov is contextualizing the problem, presenting the problem itself, and that just that's much because I'm obviously biased, and that perfectly fits in with my own theoretical inclinations. But one thing I'm really looking forward to seeing is how he tries to avoid the typical pitfalls. It's like Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Where he picks up the idol in the very beginning. That's like building Universal. The second you build a Universal, all the traps come at you. and all the skeletons
Right.
and all the arrows and all the snakes and all the spiders and the pits and everything else, right? And so you kind of have to do a little dance to avoid all those things. And he's aware of it, though, much like Indiana Jones was. So I think being aware of that and knowing what to avoid and where previous universalisms have sort of fallen into the pit can be helpful. But we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. And there is something very promising about the idea of like a reclamation of the universal after the death of universalisms. You know, it's almost it's taking the sort of postmodern critiques and not being insensitive to them, but saying, fuck, they were right insofar as they were right what they were criticizing, the particularisms of modernity. But nevertheless, let's not abandon this project of being able to speak about a universal global community or universal world politics. Like, let's not abandon that project of universalism, which is really hopeful, I think, for building political projects, you know, after the death of God, after the death of meta-narrative, after the postmodern turn, etc. So, I don't know, it kind of gets me excited, actually, to think that, wow, if there could be this project that would ground a universalism, that would avoid the traps of the Indiana Jones cave, that would actually be a really worthwhile project moving forward.
And even if it's not, even if it fails, I think attempting is valiant, because no one's going to build up the political system which changes the world in one book, right? But just the process of going through the motions and trying to develop one, and trying to think about what a universal politics would look like, both in theory and then later in practice, can help us attempt to do it. And I think the key point is that currently the system as it is currently constructed just doesn't do that at all. And there's no attempts to build a better world. So the status quo is not okay. So attempting to offer at least theoretical changes to it is a worthwhile project.
Agree. There's actually one little passage that at the end of his preface that he says that I thought was really lovely. It actually kind of had like a poetic element to it, and I thought it was beautiful. He says, you know, like people always ask you, especially non-academics, to like sum up your project in a very simple statement, right? And he says, well, here's my best effort to do that. And he uses these two logical signifiers or symbols. One is the existential quantifier, which is like a backwards capital E. And then that designates there is. And then there's the universal quantifier, which is an upside down capital A, which designates for all. And so he says this: the argument of the void universalism dilogy is that besides and beyond the infinite plurality of particular worlds that we inhabit, there is the immediate and non-totalizable universality of the world as void. World politics is nothing more yet nothing less than the... it's nothing more... Let me start that over. World politics is nothing more, yet nothing less than the affirmation of this universality in the form of the axioms of freedom, equality, and community, which seeks to transform an infinity of particular worlds on their basis, overturning the exclusions, hierarchies, and restrictions constitutive of intra-worldly orders. So that's like the non-easy way to say it, and this is for like the non-specialist right here, and I love this so much. The content of world politics is thus entirely contained in the affirmation that universality exists, that there is a for all. And then he says, to put it briefly, it's the existential quantifier and the universal quantifier. Yeah, just kind of put together. And then he says, there you go. But I love that, this idea that there is a for all. And it's just categorized or signified in just that simple, the E and the A, right? And I think there's something beautiful about that. And to me, that's, I don't know, I like it. When I read that, I was like, ooh, that's kind of like poetic and beautiful, Sergey.
Man, I knew you'd get your like knickers in a twist reading that. That reminds me of, you know, the shortest poem ever constructed?
No.
It's by Muhammad Ali.
Mm-mm.
I forget the context of it, but someone asked him for a poem or something, and he just said, me, we. That's the shortest poem ever. Me, and then we. And that kind of reminds me of existential quantifier, universal quantifier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I love it. Okay, cool. So then moving forward, what this means is, are we going to be doing this every week or every other week, Troy?
I think we said every other week, right? So we're going to split it up between more regular episodes with guests and other topics, topical things, and then doing
Right.
this book club every other week.
Great. Okay, so for the next time that we delve into this, it'll probably be a couple weeks' time, and we're going to do part 1, and then 2 weeks after that, we'll do part 2. And it's a rather short book. The volume 1's like 150 pages, and volume 2 is like 120 pages. And so if you want to check them out, they're going to be quick reads, and we're going to take our time as we go through them. So, so that's what we'll be doing. So next week, we'll probably have a guest on. The following week, we'll jump back into the text and start scratching beneath the surface and jumping into the void.
All right, so for our next segment, we're doing the Sticky Leaves. This is where one of us tells us what's giving them meaning in a meaningless universe. So, Austin, what is the existential quantifier that's giving you meaning?
It's an existential universal. It is There Is For All. This is the best show on television, and I'm binge watching the 2nd season of Atlanta, motherfucker.
Oh shit, I haven't started it yet, so you can't spoil anything, bro.
Oh, you haven't started? I felt like you had to have started this. No way, dude. You haven't started
Well, the reason is because my girl hadn't seen the first season, so we watched that again recently, and we just finished the first season.
Okay.
So I did watch Atlanta, just the first season again.
Okay. See, I'm kind of jealous that you watched the first season, because when I started the 2nd season, I was like, fuck, man, I binged the first. This is the problem with binge watching. You literally have almost 52 weeks between viewings, right? Whereas when you take it over a course of 13 weeks or 15 weeks or 20 weeks or whatever, then you've only got at most 2/3 of a year. So it's a little fresher. But I literally, a year ago, I think it was, that I watched the first season. So now I'm like, I needed a little bit of a refresher. So it took me a minute to remember what the fuck happened at the end of season 1, what was going on, and how we start off in season 2. But, bro, so unlike Westworld, where season 2 has been a serious letdown and disappointment, like bad, like it's been really disappointing. Atlanta season 2 is like just going up, man. It's going up. It's even more interesting and I think thematically mature and aesthetically mature than the first season was. And the first season I thought was excellent. So I'm just going to say that Atlanta is the best show on television. It's fucking amazing. Now, of course, I'm doing my Thanos here and I'm taking a small sample size and maybe making a generalization. But fuck you, this is my segment of the Sticky Leaves. So I'm going to make my generalization.
No one said you had to be rationally consistent in Sticky Leaves.
I am a walking contradiction, if nothing else. But I love it. I think it's fan-fucking-tastic. You know what I really like, too, is obviously Childish Gambino, Donald Glover, is getting a lot of love for the music video that he did, This Is America, which is, I think, a very poignant and beautiful and intricate piece of art. So he's getting a lot of love. But I really like to watch somebody's growth and maturity as an artist or as a performer. And he's turned into a fantastic actor, amongst other things. Like, he really is. There's a subtlety in a performance that he gives throughout Atlanta, but I've really been paying attention to it in the 2nd season that I just think is so rich, and it's so interesting to see. I mean, he's on top of the fucking world right now, and I think he deserves all the praise that he's getting. And then across the board, I mean, I don't even know how to say her name, and is it Zazie Beetz? Zazie?
Something like that, yeah. She's the new
I don't
Deadpool
know.
movie too, I think, right?
Yeah, she's Domino in the new Deadpool movie. Besides the fact that I'm in love with her, she's also fucking fantastic. And then, of course, Darius. I mean, come on.
Darius is the best.
Is there a better character on TV right now? There's a bit, and I don't want to spoil anything in season 2,
no, you
but
can
I
go
will
ahead
say
and say
this.
it for the viewers. It's okay.
There's a bit where he meets somebody, right? It's Ern's uncle, played by Cat Williams, actually. And Darius reaches down and he says, "I would say nice to meet you, but I don't believe in the concept of time." Yeah, and then I can't remember what his next line is, but it's something like, "So I'll just say meeting you again is nice," or something along those lines. But yeah, I love it. He's like, "I would say nice to meet you, but I don't believe in the concept of time." I laughed so hard, and he's so like deadpan and stoic about everything he does. There's no inflection, and it's just, he's like this sage. He's like this, he doesn't exist in this world, but he's in this world. Like, I almost feel like he's not real, but he's like supra real.
Yeah, he's definitely the unpredictable character. He adds that element to it. I remember in the first season, one of my favorite scenes is, I can't remember which episode it's in, one of the earlier episodes, and Paperboy's getting pretty big locally, right? He's on the news for like being involved in a shooting and stuff, and someone comes to his door and knocks on it. They open the door, and it's a guy with a Batman mask, and the dude just stares at him and then runs away. And it's like this kind of like chubby kid, and then Darius just says, "Man, you too hot." It was just great. His comedic timing and everything is so deadpan and perfect. Like, even the most basic things that he says, I just crack up at every time I hear it. And I like that you said the subtlety of Donald Glover's performance, right? Because, one thing I notice is whenever comedians start acting, they always seem to overdo it. Like, they always have to, because when you're a comedian, you're the only person on stage, right? And so you have to sort of attract everyone's attention all at once. At every moment, right? You're the only thing they're focusing on. If you're not entertaining, you don't hold their attention, nothing will. There's nothing else there. So they get on TV sometimes or in movies, and comedians feel like they have to do the same thing, where they just have to always be the center of attention and can't provide any subtleties or nuance in their performances. And that's definitely not true of Donald Glover in that show.
I will say I do think that improv comedians oftentimes make excellent serious actors when they do make that transition, because they're just so used to creating in the moment and being authentic to whatever the scene is giving you, rather than when you take a lot of method training acting, you sort of like impose, if you will, certain things onto the scene, and you might not be as sensitive to your partner's particularities. And so like my favorite Will Ferrell performance is a serious film, Stranger Than Fiction, right? Did you ever see that with Maggie Gyllenhaal?
I didn't see that.
Like,
no.
He's actually fantastic in it, because he's very subtle and understated. Steve Carell, his best performances are oftentimes when he does these serious roles, because he's able to actually connect. And he is a Second City guy, right? And then Adam Sandler, Punch Drunk Love, right? Like, that's probably one of his better performances, right? And then normally he totally is the case in point of what you just said about a comedian going over the top. Like, fucking watch Billy Madison, and you're like, Jesus Christ, dude.
Hey, don't shit on Billy Madison, man.
Yeah. It works, but still, come on, bro.
It works when you're 12.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder what it'd be like to watch that now. I haven't seen that literally in 20 years.
And Happy Gilmore, man. I loved those movies when I was 12.
Oh, I still... See, for me, you say don't shit on Billy Madison. My heart belongs to Happy Gilmore. So, yeah. But yeah, Atlanta, it's fucking amazing. If you haven't seen it, the second season is wrapped up, which means you can binge watch the whole thing on whatever illegal streaming service you use, or legal streaming service, government. So go check it out. I think it's fucking amazing.
I will absolutely second that, and myself have now been encouraged to do that forthwith.
And each episode's only a half hour, so binging it is an evening or two.
You can't binge Atlanta, though, man. You can watch one at a time.
I haven't watched the whole season yet, but I watched 4 at a time.
You gotta savor that, man. You're like down in chocolate bars, I feel like.
Well, remember I did say that self-destructive behavior is okay, so I was living in the excess of Atlanta, so that was my version of self-destructive behavior this week.
All right, so that's it for us this week. If you wouldn't mind going onto iTunes for looking up Owls at Dawn and giving us a 5-star review or 5-star rating and a review, that would be great. We'd really appreciate it. You can also go to owlsatdawn.com, our website, and download or listen to any of our episodes there, and also leave comments for this episode. Certainly, if you have questions or comments or evaluations or whatever it is you want to comment on about this episode or about the introduction and context of the Prozorov book we're reading, we'd love to go back and forth with you. So please go to owlsatdawn.com and do that if you'd like.
Yeah, and you can hit us on Twitter. It's owls_at_dawn. And I think that's pretty much it, homie. I mean, you can email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com as well. Sweet. All right, well, is there anything else we got to do before we get out of here?
Just one more thing I can think of.
What's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.